Among the thousands of rooms the Astors built to be seen, there was one that was never meant to exist. No servant entered, no guest questioned it, and every inventory after the patriarch's death seemed to bend around it, as if the house itself refused to speak. What was sealed in that northern wing of the Fifth Avenue mansion, and why did the family work so hard to erase its memory? The Astor Mansion on Fifth Avenue once stood like a fortress of American ambition, its marble facade polished to perfection, its windows glowing with the kind of warm, curated light that signaled wealth not merely possessed, but displayed. Inside, every room had a purpose, every corridor a social geometry carefully calculated to impress visitors and control staff. Newspapers described its winter balls as the height of New York sophistication, and society columns repeated the same polished phrases, praising the family's impeccable taste and generosity. Yet, within this architecture of visibility, there was a void, a northern wing that almost no one mentioned, not even in the most detailed household journals or servant memoirs. It appeared in early architectural sketches, faintly, like a ghost outline, only to vanish from later versions, replaced by blank sections of wall and ambiguous notes from surveyors. Whispers from former staff, collected decades later, hint at a corridor they were instructed never to cross. Some recalled a brass key, carried only by the patriarch, and a single butler whose responsibilities were never fully described. Others remembered hearing distant footsteps in a part of the house they believed was empty, or being told that certain doors were not relevant to service, a phrase that made little sense in a world where cleaning, dusting, and maintaining order were the backbone of domestic labor. Even the mansion's own inventories betray a strange rhythm. Corridors listed but never measured, rooms acknowledged but never described. And after the patriarch's death, a set of non-essential documents, reportedly burned for the sake of reorganization. No one ever clarified what those documents contained. Contemporary newspapers, always eager to blend rumor with reputation, occasionally alluded to private Astor deliberations or unlisted visitors who came through the side entrance and departed before dawn. Yet nothing published dared to suggest what internal records imply, that the sealed wing may have been more than architectural excess. Transfers made quietly between family accounts, sudden relocations of distant relatives, and unexplained alterations to legal documents hint at a deeper story, one guarded through silence, privilege, and the convenient disappearance of paper trails. A sealed room in the Gilded Age was rarely just a room. It was often a negotiation chamber, a vault of decisions, or a sanctuary for truths deemed unfit for daylight. Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion? Historians still debate whether the northern wing was used for confidential political meetings, financial maneuvers, or something far more personal, something that demanded both architectural isolation and administrative erasure. What remains consistent across every surviving account is the effort to ensure this part of the house stayed unoccupied, unexamined, and ultimately unremembered. And as we step deeper into this investigation, keep in mind, the most revealing parts of elite history are often the ones that were meant to disappear. The sealed wing of the Astor Mansion was one such space, a place where silence became structure, and where the truth, whatever it was, died behind a locked door the servants were never allowed to touch. In every Gilded Age mansion, there was an invisible choreography designed to keep the staff forever out of sight. Back staircases worn smooth by hurried footsteps, service corridors so narrow 2 maids couldn't pass without turning their shoulders, and bell systems that allowed the elite to summon help without ever seeing the hands that prepared their world. But the Astor Mansion on Fifth Avenue sharpened that choreography into something far more deliberate. Household ledgers from the period show the usual divisions: parlor maids, footmen, cooks, laundresses. Yet tucked between their names is a peculiar annotation repeated in several lists. No service beyond North Corridor. It appears clipped, almost defensive, as if explaining itself too much might reveal the logic behind it. Among the testimonies collected decades later, A former maid described that corridor as the boundary one didn't question. She recalled the hush that fell whenever a footman realized he had climbed one flight too far or turned the wrong corner during evening rounds. Another reference appears in the private notes of a housekeeper who served under 2 generations of Astors. Rooms designated for the family only, cleaning not required, keys retained by Mr. A and head butler. Indo. Most households, such a statement would be laughable. Dust spared no one, not even the wealthy. But here, the absence of cleaning staff was part of the architecture, a silence engineered with the same care as the mansion's balustrades and imported chandeliers. The more one examines the payrolls, the more the pattern becomes unsettling. A butler listed as assigned to restricted areas, receiving wages slightly higher than those supervising entire floors. A second entry marked temporary reassignment, no documentation, coinciding with the year a political guest was rumored to have stayed longer than intended. And then there are the gaps, notes about staff rotations that simply stop for a season, as if the house had no reason to record movements near a wing it pretended not to use. In this hierarchy, where every misstep could cost a servant their livelihood, the forbidden lines were obeyed with near religious precision. A maid could request better gloves, a cook could complain about the ice delivery, but no one questioned a sealed door. Even today, reading those sparse documents, there is a faint tremor between the lines, a sense that curiosity was more dangerous than disobedience. And one can't help but wonder, with a boundary drawn so sharply, would you have dared cross it, knowing the house was designed to punish the very idea of looking behind certain doors? Newspapers of the era celebrated the Astors as pillars of taste, but behind the celebratory prose were quiet omissions. Servants' entrances were photographed, but not the corridor that ended abruptly in a wall newly plastered during the 1880s expansion. Society pages detailed the arrangement of parlors and ballrooms, yet none mentioned the northern wing, despite its size, despite its location, despite its strange absence from later architectural surveys. When the mansion was partially renovated in the early 1900s, contractors noted a sealed passageway and irregular joinery, but the report forwarded to city assessors excluded those phrases entirely. Someone trimmed the truth before it reached the public record. Whispers of hidden heirs, of guests whose names never entered the ledger, of meetings held in rooms that vanished from the floor plan. These fragments survive only because some documents escaped the purge. A torn page in a servant's diary, a delivery receipt with an address that doesn't match the layout preserved in archives, a legal notice hinting at internal matters of inheritance. Filed the same month, a window overlooking the north courtyard was abruptly boarded from within. Even now, when one piece after another is laid out, altered records, erased corridors, a team of servants trained to navigate around an absence, the mystery refuses to resolve itself. And in the dim light of those surviving documents, one detail stands out with disturbing clarity. A door listed in the original blueprint that does not appear in any subsequent version. Its frame scraped away, its purpose erased so thoroughly that only a faint ink impression remains, like the last breath of a truth the family intended never to be found. If you trace the early blueprints of the Astor Mansion, long before the society pages crowned it the apex of Fifth Avenue prestige, the northern wing appears quietly, almost modestly, among the guest suites and family rooms. In the earliest architectural drafts, still bearing the pencil strokes of McKim, Mead, and White apprentices, you can follow a clean line of circulation from the central staircase into a sequence of rooms illuminated by tall, narrow windows. Nothing about those drawings suggests secrecy. They reflect the logic of a household preparing for a strategic marriage, a rising political alliance, and the pressure of maintaining a public image polished enough to withstand the scrutiny of a rapidly expanding elite. Yet somewhere between those first sketches and the final approved plans filed with the city, the corridor that once connected the mansion's heart to its northern rooms begins to blur, as if the ink itself hesitated. The shift occurs after a pivotal family event, one discreetly mentioned in letters but never openly discussed. The marriage of a young Astor to a partner whose lineage was considered convenient but not entirely advantageous triggered a wave of internal reorganizations. Newspaper clippings from the time hint at a necessary period of improvement to the mansion, framed as a gift to mark the union. But buried in the correspondence between contractors and the family's attorneys are notes far less celebratory. Door relocation approved, structural revisions requested, access points removed. Such phrases, stripped of detail, are precisely the kind favored by families who understood how fragile reputations could be when examined too closely. Older inventories describe the northern rooms as guest accommodations, family suites, and library annexes. Later ones, however, speak of utility space, non-essential areas, or worse, omit them entirely. It is not that the rooms disappeared. It is that the language surrounding them shifted from public-facing decorum to calculated ambiguity. Walls thickened. A doorway was quietly absorbed into a closet that made little architectural sense. A seemingly decorative panel near the upper landing appears only after 1884, its wood grain mismatched, the joinery deliberately flush, as though placed to erase the memory of something once accessible behind it. Those who worked in the house at the time recalled the transition, not with drama, but with silence. A housemaid noted that one spring she carried linens through a corridor she'd used for years, and by the following winter, that same corridor stopped at a wall that had not been there before. The head butler, in his meticulous daily logs, scribbled new routes for serving staff, rerouting them away from the northern wing with the explanation, "Construction, do not enter." But the renovations ended long before the restrictions did. Even after the dust settled, no one was permitted to cross the new boundaries. Not maids, not footmen, not even the senior staff who had managed the mansion through births, deaths, and political seasons. The timing becomes even more suspect when compared to legal filings from the same period. A dispute involving a relative whose claim to a portion of the estate was quietly settled through an agreement sealed by the family's lawyers appears, alongside ledger entries for materials purchased for internal adjustments. Court transcripts from the case use strangely cautious phrasing, matters unnecessary to the estate at large, resolved through private documentation. The language echoes the renovations, something being tucked away, not erased but placed out of reach, as if the house itself was being reshaped to contain a secret that couldn't be permitted to wander into daylight. In a world where inheritance was both a weapon and a liability, the sealing of a wing was not merely an architectural choice, it was an act of strategy. A space could be hidden more effectively than a document. A corridor could swallow reputations that might otherwise haunt a dynasty's public image. It aligned with the era's darker instincts, the manipulation of the press, the cultivation of silence among staff, the willingness to revise historical memory in real time. Gilded Age families understood that forbidden rooms spoke loudly in private, while remaining invisible to the outside world, a perfect equilibrium for secrets with too much gravity to simply burn. And when you look at the surviving plans side by side, the early drafts with their open pathways and the later ones trimmed into compliance, one detail stands out with a chill that no historian can fully ignore. A room clearly labeled in the original blueprint, its measurements precise, its windows facing the courtyard. Yet in every version that followed, that room has been replaced by a blank expanse of uninterrupted wall, as though the house exhaled and swallowed it whole. The ink smudge where its label once stood lingers on the page like a fingerprint someone tried too late to erase. In any Gilded Age household, the butler was the axis on which the entire domestic world turned. He carried the keys, oversaw the wine cellar, monitored the footmen's rotations, and controlled the invisible machinery that kept the family's public image polished. But in the Astor mansion, one detail stands out the moment you compare the surviving household papers. There were 2 butlers listed for overlapping years, yet only one appears repeatedly beside a cryptic annotation, assigned to North Wing duties. His name surfaces quietly, never in the society pages, never in the family memoirs. but in the mundane clutter of administrative documents, laundry tallies, shift schedules, delivery logs. Each time his name appears, it is accompanied by a phrase that seems to apologize for its own existence. Access permitted, authorized entry, key retained in personal custody. It is the kind of phrasing usually reserved for vaults and ledgers, not rooms in a private residence. What makes this anomaly more unsettling is that nothing about the North Wing, at least in public documents, required such attention. There are no cleaning notes, no reports of needed repairs, no mention of replacement locks or worn-down hinges. Most mansions of the era produced endless trails of receipts for paint, plaster, linens, oil lamps, and later electric fittings. Yet for this section of the Astor estate, there is nothing. An unbroken absence that feels curated, as though someone understood that the most efficient way to hide a room was to behave as though it never demanded maintenance. The butler assigned to it emerges then, not as a servant in the traditional sense, but as a warden, someone whose real task was to ensure that the stillness behind those doors remained undisturbed. Witness accounts from decades later subtly confirm this. A former parlor maid recalled glancing up the back staircase once and noticing the butler standing unusually still at the end of the landing, his posture rigid, the lamp in his hand casting a narrow glow that stopped exactly at the first door of the sealed corridor. She remembered how he shifted slightly, not in greeting, but in quiet warning, as if the air itself carried boundaries one was expected to respect. A footman wrote, in his later years, that he never understood why a man of such senior rank spent hours standing in a part of the house no one else used, and that the butler's ledger, kept strictly separate from the general household book, was locked inside a drawer no other servant ever saw opened. Correspondence between Astor attorneys and their building contractors adds another layer to this strange arrangement. While discussing renovations, an architect asked whether the northern rooms would require updates to match the mansion's new electrical systems. The reply, clipped and immediate, read, "Only Mr. will determine necessity." The name is partially smudged, but the phrasing is unmistakable. A butler, not an Astor, not an architect, held authority over decisions affecting a physical section of the house. That level of trust implies not loyalty alone, but complicity, a shared understanding of what those walls contained and why it was essential they remained untouched. Even the surviving payrolls reflect an unusual hierarchy. The designated butler received a small yet consistent increase each year, more than the chef, more than the steward, more than any other member of staff except the primary household butler. Yet there is no mention of him hosting dinners, attending the family during travel, or managing the reception rooms. His responsibilities seem to have existed in a parallel dimension of the mansion, off the books, out of sight, yet central enough to justify unwavering employment, even through seasons of staff change. A man whose silence, it seems, was part of the household budget. The Golden Age secrets of America's wealthiest families seldom relied on dramatic gestures. Instead, they depended on carefully orchestrated silence, on men like this butler, whose presence at a locked door was more effective than any written order could ever be. Hidden heirs, forbidden rooms, quiet negotiations carried out at twilight. These stories rarely leave paper trails. They live in routines, in patterns, in the slight tightening of a man's grip around a key he never let out of his sight. And slowly, the North Wing transformed from an architectural feature into a living boundary, a place where footsteps stopped, where questions were swallowed, where truth hardened into secrecy. But in one surviving document, misfiled in a later estate inventory, a detail breaks the carefully maintained stillness. Amid financial entries and household purchases, a name appears, written neatly, then struck through with deliberate pressure, the ink cutting deep into the page. It is listed under Special Assignments, North Wing. No explanation follows, no replacement name, only that violent erasure. And beside it, barely visible in the paper's grain, the faint outline of a second key drawn in pencil, as though someone began to sketch it, and then thought better of leaving even that behind. For anyone examining the Astor Mansion through surviving descriptions alone, the guest rooms appear harmless, sumptuous suites arranged for visiting dignitaries, distant relatives, or friends passing through New York's social season. But when you study the diaries, delivery slips, and faint remarks tucked into society columns, a different pattern emerges. Those rooms closest to the sealed northern wing behaved nothing like ordinary accommodations. Guests rarely stayed there. When they did, their names seldom appeared in the household ledger. The lamps in those suites burned later than the rest of the house, often long past the hour when the staff retreated to their quarters. And more than once, a carriage arrived through the side entrance without a footman's formal announcement, a quiet intrusion into the mansion's immaculate rhythm. A senator's private secretary once wrote, in a letter that survived only because it was misfiled, that he was received not in the parlor but in one of the north rooms by arrangement. He described the encounter with careful vagueness, referring to matters requiring discretion and the courtesy of privacy not afforded in public clubs. What is remarkable is not the meeting itself. Political understandings were common in Gilded Age New York, but the location. Why choose a corner of the house that, by then, had been architecturally folded into near invisibility? Why not the ornate drawing rooms or the richly upholstered library, where reputation was showcased like art? The answer surfaces quietly in billing records. Certain suites, always. The same three adjacent to the sealed corridor were marked with ambiguous entries: guest usage, temporary accommodation, private business. The descriptions never change, even across years. There are no notes about linen replacements, no updated furnishings, none of the typical wear and tear expenditures tied to a room regularly occupied. Instead, deliveries associated with those areas involve items not linked to hospitality at all: ink orders, paper bundles, sealed crates containing writing desks, and once a delivery of heavy curtains that matched no known decorative scheme in the mansion. The curtains were marked simply North Wing. This aligns with a broader culture of backdoor negotiations that defined the era's elite. Banks merged after conversations held in private residences rather than boardrooms. Railroad barons carved up territory in parlors shielded from reporters. These encounters, called understandings, thrived precisely because they left minimal paper trails. A handshake in a wealthy home carried more weight than a statement in a courtroom. The Astor guest rooms, bordering the forbidden corridor, became an ideal arena for such dealings. Too private to attract suspicion, yet close enough to the sealed wing to suggest that not all conversations were meant for every ear in the house. As the years passed, the record of these meetings grew even fainter. One household account lists a multi-day stay by an unnamed business visitor, even though no carriage arrivals were noted and no meals were billed to the kitchen. Another entry subtracts a full week's worth of coal for heating north parlor rooms. Yet the mansion was not hosting public guests at the time. And in one season's ledger, the entire month of October is wiped clean of activity for the northern suites, replaced with identical hash marks that clearly signify something was removed or never recorded. Cross-referencing these blank spaces with newspaper archives reveals an eerie synchronicity. During several of these months, stories circulated, quietly, then disappeared, about contested inheritances, disputed wills, and unnamed creditors negotiating with unnamed families. The articles never used the word Astor, yet their timing mirrors the mansion's gaps too precisely to ignore. These weren't simply guest rooms. They were staging grounds for decisions the public was never meant to witness. Rearranged stocks, softened political threats, concessions agreed upon in silence, and in some cases, quiet resolutions involving hidden heirs whose existence would have fractured a carefully cultivated lineage. Even the tone of private letters from Astor associates hints at this layered purpose. One financier wrote to a colleague, "I shall visit the house tonight, through the side." Another letter advises, "Ensure he is taken to the north rooms, the others are inappropriate." The ellipsis hangs on the page like a breath withheld, suggesting knowledge left safely unspoken. And faced with such patterns, Doors closed, names omitted, receipts truncated. One question lingers like dust in lamplight. With this combination of power, sealed thresholds, and deliberately erased records, would you speak or would you remain silent, understanding that some Golden Age secrets were never intended to survive the walls that contained them? By the time the mansion underwent a later renovation, the role of those rooms had been so thoroughly obscured that the official documents describe them merely as guest accommodations, even though their outlines on the blueprint don't quite match. One of the suites is missing a window that earlier plans insist should be there. Another shows a closet that seems to have absorbed an entire doorway. The architects provide no explanation, and the estate papers that might have clarified the discrepancy have long since vanished. But tucked inside an old envelope found in a private archive, date smeared, edges brittle, there is a photograph of one of these rooms. The furniture is unmistakably Astor, the wallpaper consistent with the period. Yet behind the writing desk stands something impossible to reconcile. A second door, unadorned, narrow, and absent from every known floor plan. A doorway that should not have existed at all, left captured in a single fading frame, defying the official version of the house like a quiet, unblinking witness. When a great Gilded Age fortune passed from one generation to the next, the law required more than morning clothes and somber announcements. It required paperwork. Wills, codicils, estate inventories, insurance valuations. Every object with a price or a pedigree was supposed to be named, weighed, and measured. The Astors understood this better than most. Their ledgers read like a parallel biography. Paintings catalogued by artist and provenance, silver listed down to the last teaspoon, even worn carpets tagged with their original vendor. Which is why, when you reach the Y section labeled Papers and Correspondence in their estate inventories, the sudden vagueness lands like a closed door in a well-lit corridor. At first, the language seems harmless. After the death of a key family member, the clerk recording the estate notes in crisp handwriting, various papers disposed of, no ongoing financial relevance. The phrase appears once, then reappears in the next generation's documentation. Assorted correspondence eliminated, content without lasting significance. For almost any other household, such wording might pass unnoticed. But for a dynasty that leveraged letters, receipts, and private notes as weapons and shields, the idea that entire bundles of documents lacked relevance feels less like an assessment and more like a decision. Look closely, and you begin to see a pattern. The items described in excruciating detail, land holdings, art, jewelry, are never marked for destruction. Only the paper. Only the records of words spoken, promises made. Arrangements negotiated just beyond the reach of courts and newspapers. One inventory references a reorganization of family archives, followed by an understated line, excess materials culled, remaining records indexed. There is no list of what was removed, no itemization, no acknowledgement that anything of substance might have been lost. It is as if the family chose to summarize an entire history with the sweep of a single phrase, confident that no one outside their circle would ever think to ask what, exactly, had been called. Cross-reference these estate documents with known events, and the timing becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. Periods of archive reorganization coincide with rumors of contested inheritances, stories of unexpected claimants, quiet settlements reached behind carved doors. Legal notices of disputes resolved amicably appear in public records just months before inventories mention papers destroyed. In a world where hidden heirs could destabilize, carefully arranged lines of succession, and where erased records might mean the difference between a scandal and a polite omission, the controlled burning of select documents was not negligence. It was strategy. The northern wing surfaces in this context not as a room, but as a number. In the inventories, its footprint is measured, square footage, window count, appraised value as part of the whole structure. Yet there is never any mention of what occupied that space. No shelves listed under O. Library fixtures, No desk contents, no file boxes, no correspondence cabinets. For every other section of the mansion, contents and container appear together. Parlors have furniture, bedrooms have wardrobes and linens. Even storage rooms earn a line or two. But the north wing, adjacent to the forbidden rooms and the guest suites that never behaved like simple accommodations, is treated as a hollow, valuable in size, yet curiously empty on paper. The silence becomes louder when you consult insurance documents. Companies of the time insisted on detailed descriptions of high-value items, especially artwork and documents whose loss could trigger litigation. Policies list paintings by name, identify sculpture by material and origin, and occasionally mention important correspondence stored in office cabinets. Yet in the years when the northern wing was still structurally intact, the only reference that might connect to it reads, "Certain private records, client elects not to specify." The premium is slightly higher than one would expect, as though the insurer understood they were covering something unspoken. Even on a contract designed to calculate risk, ambiguity was carefully maintained. Beyond the official ledgers, faint traces of what once existed drift through secondary sources. A junior clerk in a law firm wrote, in the margin of a draft, "Original letters to be retained at house, copies sufficient for file." A fireproof safe purchased for the mansion is described in a catalog as suitable for securities, sensitive correspondence, and legal instruments not intended for public archives. No one writes down the names of the people implicated by those instruments. No hand dares to spell out the nature of the dark legacy they were built to protect, but their absence in later records, paired with those infuriating phrases about papers destroyed, suggests that at some point someone decided the risk of preservation outweighed the comfort of documentation. The logic is consistent with the habits of the era's elite. When reputations were threatened, damage was not managed through transparency. It was contained through controlled oblivion. Families like the Astors did not wait for journalists or reformers to uncover awkward truths. They commissioned discreet legal opinions, adjusted wills, and, when necessary, ensured that any document capable of confirming an uncomfortable lineage, a concealed debt, or an unflattering alliance, quietly disappeared. In private, letters might be read one last time under the low light of a library lamp before being consigned to the fire. Outside, the city continued to admire facades and count donations, unaware of how much of that grandeur rested on ash. Public archives, too, bear the fingerprints of intentional omission. City property records that should, in theory, reflect every modification to a building stop mentioning interior alterations at the exact moment the family begins, referring to internal reconfigurations in their own notes. The discrepancy seems small, just a missing line here, a vague description there, but over decades those gaps accumulate. What survives in the public eye is a polished outline, a prestigious address, a lineage uninterrupted, a reputation intact. The rest lives only in the spaces between what was written and what was deliberately left unsaid. And so the sealed wing occupies an eerie middle ground, acknowledged, measured, insured, yet stripped of narrative. Its square footage is preserved in the inventories, but its contents vanish into phrases like papers of no value retained by family discretion and non-essential documentation removed. The wording is cold, almost bureaucratic, but behind it there is a human calculus, the quiet agreement that some truths would cost too much if allowed to endure on paper. In that sense, the walls of the North Wing became more than boundaries. They became the last witnesses to decisions that no document was permitted to record. Decades later, when researchers sift through what remains, one page stands out among the estate files. It is a neatly typed list, grouping items by category: real property, financial assets, personal effects, miscellaneous papers. Each line has been checked and annotated in tidy pencil, values adjusted, notes added. Only one entry has been treated differently. Next to Correspondence, North Wing Archive, the original valuation is scratched out so heavily. The paper fibers lift, the ink beneath obliterated, No new amount is written in its place. Instead, a single word appears in the margin, pressed into the page with enough force to leave an impression on the sheet below. Removed. No date, no explanation, just that one solitary verdict. An entire history reduced to a scar where numbers and names should have been. In families like the Astors, money did not simply flow downward. It was directed, negotiated, and, when necessary, quietly intercepted. A Gilded Age fortune was not just a balance of numbers, but a map of who was allowed to exist within the lineage, and who would be pushed to its edges, or off the page entirely. Publicly, the family trees printed in society registers looked tidy, marriages aligned with other powerful names, children counted in neat columns, branches extending in all the right directions. But behind those polished diagrams, in the forbidden rooms near the sealed wing, more complex versions of the story were being written, and then carefully unmade. Draft wills and early trust documents that survive in peripheral archives show something the final versions do not: extra names. In one early draft, a beneficiary appears as E. Astor, provisions to be determined, placed between two fully recognized heirs. In the final, notarized version, the line closes seamlessly, no initial, no gap, no explanation. The ink from the original entry has been scraped just enough to leave the faintest indentation, visible only when the paper is tilted under a slant of light. Another set of papers, never filed but preserved in a lawyer's personal file, lists a modest annuity for a lady presently residing in Massachusetts, to be continued without public disclosure. The instruction is clear. Support is to be given, but the connection is not to be named. This is where the logic of succession folds into the mystery of the sealed wing. The negotiations that shaped these quiet arrangements did not happen in courtrooms or bustling law offices. They happened in those North Side guest rooms, the ones that never behaved like simple accommodations, separated from the rest of the house by a corridor. Servants were taught not to see. Bankers, attorneys, and discreet intermediaries entered through the side entrance, removed their gloves in silence, and were shown to spaces where the family's golden age secrets could be discussed without echo. There, the future of hidden heirs was decided over carefully. Poured drinks and documents laid flat on polished wood. The erasure of an heir rarely announced itself as drama. It emerged instead as absence. A child raised away from the city, supported through funds that appeared on no public ledger. A woman who left New York for her health and never returned, yet received regular payments through an intermediary account. A surname altered by a single letter when it appeared in a census, as if the error had been allowed to remain because it served a purpose. In some cases, the only trace left is the pattern of movement. A small house purchased quietly in a distant town, its deed held by a trust with no obvious link to the Astors, yet funded from a pool of money that appeared just after one of those reorganizations of family papers. The press, when it sniffed near these stories, was steered away with practiced ease. Editors were offered more interesting headlines: charitable donations, architectural projects, glittering balls. Columnists received invitations to events timed suspiciously close to potentially compromising hearings, their attention redirected by new gowns, guest lists, and carefully orchestrated photographs. The machinery of reputation worked as relentlessly as any factory floor, feeding the public a narrative robust enough that few thought to question what wasn't there. If a rumor surfaced about a forgotten child or an unofficial union, it was dismissed as envy, as gossip, as the natural byproduct of extraordinary wealth. Yet the paper trail, even in its damaged state, refuses to lie completely. A notation in the margin of a legal draft, "Remove beneficiary, resolved by private means," sits uneasily beside a later reference to a special disbursement fund with no listed recipients. A clerk's cramped handwriting, tucked between lines of more formal script, records a meeting held at residence, terms adjusted to avoid scandal. These are not the phrases of people who simply lost track of a relative. They are the careful language of a dynasty paying the price required to keep its public branches straight, while its hidden limbs remained unseen. Within that context, the sealed wing takes on a different weight. It begins to look less like a mere architectural oddity and more like an internal archive, not of paper, but of decisions. A place where futures were redirected, identities negotiated, and entire lives repositioned just far enough from the main line to keep the facade unbroken. The silent witnesses to those choices were not only the walls, but the routines built around them. The butler with the only key, the guest rooms forever half-occupied, the staff trained to walk the long way around. In time, the official family histories would be printed, books bound in leather, names arranged with the confidence of inevitability. Those volumes speak of continuity, of stability, of a lineage untouched by the kind of fractures that mark less disciplined fortunes. They do not mention the settlements signed in the north rooms, the debates that echoed down the sealed corridor, the quiet shuffling of names that took place out of reach of the public archive. They certainly do not acknowledge the people whose lives continued in the shadow of the house, financed by money that never explained itself. And yet, some images resist complete burial. In a box of mixed estate ephemera, clippings, invitations, calling cards, there lies an old family photograph taken on a terrace that once overlooked the northern side of the mansion. The group is arranged in the familiar formation: patriarch seated, recognized heirs standing at his shoulder, spouses and siblings fanned outward in an elegant semicircle. At first glance, it matches every other portrait of the era, but upon closer inspection, one detail breaks the surface of that carefully staged harmony. Between two figures, where the outline of another person should be, the emulsion has been deliberately disturbed. The shape of a body remains, the fall of a sleeve, the faint suggestion of a collar, but the face has been scratched away, reduced to a pale, formless void amidst a row of preserved features. No note on the back of the photograph identifies who stood there. Only the pressure of the fingernails that removed the face remains, dug into the paper as if someone wanted to make sure that, at least in the official memory of the Astor line, this presence would remain permanently and irrevocably unnamed. The moment of rupture came, as it often did in Gilded Age dynasties, with a funeral that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. Carriages lined Fifth Avenue, black cloth draped the doors, and the newspapers printed solemn tributes to a man they described as a pillar of American wealth and restraint. Inside the mansion, mirrors were veiled, clocks stopped, and the staff moved with the careful slowness expected of a house in mourning. Yet even as condolences arrived on thick, cream-colored paper, another kind of activity began, quieter, sharper, recorded not in eulogies but in the language of appraisers, builders, and lawyers who had been waiting for precisely this transition. Within weeks of the patriarch's death, the first requests for estimates reached the offices of favored architects and contractors. The phrasing was polite, almost casual. Proposals for modernization, rationalization of interior circulation, and adjustments to accommodate changing domestic needs. No public statement mentioned the northern wing. No obituary suggested that a sealed section of the house had lost its primary guardian. But in the internal correspondence, a pattern forms. One contractor notes, substantial alterations to the existing plan, particularly on the upper floors, and then, in a line that seems almost thrown away, refers to redundant interior doors to be removed. Redundant, an odd description for passages that had been so fiercely protected. Appraisers sent to reassess. The property after the inheritance shift recorded the mansion's value with their usual precision, yet their reports contain a recurring phrase. Layout modified since prior inspection, north section simplified. Simplified is a generous word for what appears to have taken place. Early sketches from before the patriarch's death show a tangle of corridors and rooms in that quadrant of the house, guest suites, service passages, and the now infamous sealed wing. Later diagrams, drawn after the so-called modernization, present a cleaner outline. Fewer doors, fewer corners, fewer opportunities for a curious eye to linger. What remains is the footprint of the space, but not its inner life. At almost the same moment, the estate files record the destruction of yet another tranche of documents. The justification is, again, bland. Papers of no current legal value disposed of. The timing, however, is anything but neutral. First, sensitive correspondence is removed from the archives under the guise of irrelevance. Then, the portion of the house most associated with those missing papers undergoes a structural transformation. Walls are thickened. Separate rooms are merged into anonymous storage. Passageways that once connected the sealed wing to the rest of the mansion are rationalized, a term that sounds efficient until you realize it often meant erasing any trace of what had been there before. The builder's notes, where they survive, reveal small, telling details. A foreman remarks that in the north section, old door frames uncovered beneath paneling, instructed to close and plaster flush. Another mentions that certain areas show signs of having been altered once before, long prior to these works. Door hinges without doors, marks on the floor where furniture had been, a section of wall with a slight resonance when tapped, as though hollowed. No one writes down what, if anything, was found when those spaces were opened, however briefly. The records fall silent, precisely at the point where curiosity would normally take over. It is tempting to see these renovations as simply part of a broader trend. The early 20th century was not kind to many Gilded Age mansions. Tastes shifted. Servants became harder to retain. Modern conveniences demanded new wiring, new plumbing, new layouts. But the way the Astor Mansion changed after the patriarch's death does not look like mere adaptation. It looks like a carefully choreographed dismantling of a problem. The forbidden rooms near the sealed wing, once used for quiet negotiations about hidden heirs and disputed inheritances, lose their extra doors. The butler with the only key no longer appears in the payrolls. The northern corridor that staff had been taught to avoid is absorbed into a more innocuous configuration. A linen closet here, a widened wall there, until its very existence becomes difficult to prove. And then there is the language used when the property is described to potential buyers and insurers in the years that follow. Gone are the hints of a private archive or discreet arrangements for certain guests. The house becomes, in official parlance, simply a grand Fifth Avenue residence with generous accommodations. The north wing is mentioned only as part of the overall square footage, its history compressed into a number. On paper, the dark legacy of that section has been neutralized. In brick and plaster, however, the story is not quite so easily erased. Because physical spaces have a way of remembering what paper tries to forget. Years later, when a later generation authorizes another round of repairs, this time to address cracking plaster and outdated wiring, workers open sections of the northern walls and pause. Behind one layer of lath and plaster, they uncover the faint curve of an older doorway, its edges neatly cut off by more recent construction. A strip of floor bears the lighter outline where a threshold once sat. On a brick column, long hidden behind a rebuilt partition, someone had scratched a small mark. A single initial, followed by a date that coincides with the period of the first remodel after the patriarch died. No one can say who made it or why, but the timing is uncomfortably precise. It raises an uneasy question, one that reaches beyond this single house. What would you do if, decades after the fact, you found physical evidence of a space your archives insist never mattered? Marks where doors once hung, corridors that stop abruptly. In new walls, valuations referring to rooms no longer accessible. Do you rewrite your report to match the official story? Or do you let the architecture speak back against the curated memory of the family that paid you? In a world built on controlled narratives, even a seam in the plaster can begin to sound like a silent witness. For the Astor Mansion, this was the moment when the sealed wing became something else entirely. While the patriarch lived, it had been forbidden, a locked zone whose existence depended on control. After his death, it was broken apart, scattered through the house in fragments of structure and shadow. It ceased to function as a single, intact, forbidden room and instead became an absence distributed across closets, widened walls, and rationalized corridors. The secrecy did not end. It simply changed form, diffusing into architecture that no longer admitted what it had once contained. And yet, amid the neat stacks of revised blueprints, one sheet refuses to fall fully into line. Drawn in firm ink, it shows the post-remodel mansion as the family wanted it remembered. Halls aligned, rooms simplified, no awkward recesses in the north wing. But along the margin, near the upper floors, there is a faint, almost translucent rectangle. An earlier doorway, lightly traced, never fully erased when the new plan was drafted on top of the old. It does not carry a label, and in the legend there is no symbol to match it. A door that no longer officially exists still lingers there, ghosted beneath the newer lines, contradicting the clean story the estate tried so hard to present. By the time the northern wing of the Astor mansion had been quietly dismantled and rewritten into smoother floor plans, the world outside Fifth Avenue was no longer the one that had allowed fortunes to grow in near total shadow. The late 19th century had hardened into a new kind of scrutiny. Progressive reformers were beginning to question how so much wealth could rest in so few hands. Muckraking journalists were peering into tenements and corporate boardrooms with equal intensity, and the word trust was no longer spoken with admiration but with suspicion. In such an atmosphere, a scandal involving one of America's most visible dynasties would not have been confined to gossip. It could have cracked open investigations into monopolies, revisited tax arrangements, and given political opponents the ammunition they needed to attack not just a family, but a system. If you want to understand why a house would carry forbidden rooms like a burden, you have to place those walls back inside that shifting landscape. Newspapers that once limited themselves to reporting on balls and marriages began experimenting with something bolder. Articles asked who paid for campaign posters and why certain candidates seemed unusually aligned with railroad interests. Editorials hinted that great endowments to universities and charities made convenient distractions from less presentable dealings. For a family like the Astors, whose holdings touched real estate, transportation, and finance, a single packet of letters, linking dates of political donations to stock movements or legislative votes, could become the connective tissue for a story no editor would be able to resist. The sealed wing then ceases to look like an eccentric indulgence and instead resembles a buffer, a part of the house where such threads might be kept under watch, never allowed to escape into the unpredictable air of public discourse. Among the few fragments that survived the pruning of their archives are references to private commitments, discretionary arrangements, and understandings not suitable for inclusion in general statements. Their vagueness is deliberate, but the context is suggestive. Some coincide with labor disputes in properties linked indirectly to the Astor portfolio, strikes in buildings they financed but did not officially manage, accidents in construction, projects where subcontractors absorbed legal blame while investors watched from a distance. A ledger note mentions a settlement reached in-house, followed by an unitemized outflow of funds and a terse remark, documentation to remain separate. Such euphemisms speak a familiar language. The purchase of silence, the smoothing of tragedies that might otherwise have become test cases for tougher regulations. At the same time, campaign finance operated in an era long before formal disclosure laws. Candidates rarely admitted exactly how their war chests were filled. Behind the scenes, fortunes like the Astors could shape elections without leaving more than a handful of receipts and a memory shared by a few men in tailored coats. Imagine then what might have been stored just beyond the reach of ordinary staff in that northern section. Lists of promised contributions, drafts of speeches revised at the suggestion of donors, letters that blurred the line between public service and private obligation. In an age when the Gilded Age facade was cracking, such paper did not merely represent embarrassment, it represented liability. The danger was never the single secret, neatly contained. It was the chain, names, dates, and sums that, once linked, could transform rumor into proof. A donation recorded on the same day as a crucial vote in Congress. A note acknowledging knowledge of unsafe conditions in a tenement later destroyed by fire. A handwritten acknowledgement of an arrangement in which a union organizer's absence was regrettable but necessary. Alone, each document might be explained away. Together, they could form a narrative of complicity that no amount of philanthropy could easily erase. Families in this position learned to think in terms of risk management generations before the term itself became fashionable. They knew that photographs could be curated, interviews rehearsed, and public appearances staged. But paper, with its dates and signatures, remained stubborn. So they cultivated alternative methods. Lawyers drafted letters that avoided names, referring instead to "our mutual friend." Financial instructions were routed through intermediaries, leaving only the vaguest hints of origin. When even that felt too exposed, conversations moved entirely into spaces like those former guest rooms near the sealed wing, where nothing more durable than memory would be allowed to carry the weight of an agreement, and when memories threatened to linger in the wrong. Minds, generous appointments, sudden relocations, or quiet stipends standardized the price of forgetting. Even the press could be managed with some finesse. Publishers relied on advertising and access. A family capable of offering both held a strong position. A critical piece could be delayed by promising an exclusive society feature, or a charitable announcement better suited to selling papers without angering the elite. Reporters who tried to dig too close to the core of certain stories often found their paths diverted, not by crude threats, but by redirections. Files misplaced, witnesses encouraged to remember less, officials reminded of their own debts. One begins to see how a physical space like the northern wing, stripped of servants and reduced on paper to bland measurements, might serve as the quiet center of this web of influence, a room not just of Golden Age secrets, but of calculations about which truths the era could survive. Over decades, as antitrust cases multiplied and the language of public accountability sharpened, the calculus only intensified. What scandal exactly would have justified this long choreography of sealed doors, erased records, and carefully timed remodels? Perhaps it was not a single revelation, but a convergence. The existence of hidden heirs whose claims, if acknowledged, might have fractured trusts carefully designed to keep capital intact. Financial links tying the family's prosperity to catastrophes described in the papers as unfortunate acts of God, when private correspondence suggested otherwise. Political favors traded in shadowed suites that overlooked a city increasingly impatient with excess. Whatever the exact combination, the answer likely lay not in one damning scene, but in the possibility that outside investigators, reformers, or journalists could follow the trail from wing to ledger to headline. In that light, the cost of maintaining unused walls was small compared to the cost of allowing their MD contents, even the knowledge that such contents had once existed, to enter the broader conversation about how the Gilded Age had really been built. The North Wing becomes, in this reading, less an architectural curiosity than a calculated compromise, a zone of controlled containment where the family agreed to confine certain risks so that the rest of their world could remain intact. The house could be opened for carefully guided tours, its surviving rooms photographed, its name attached to foundations and institutions, but the memory of what the sealed rooms had once held would not be included in any public brochure. Long after the doors were removed and the corridors simplified, the logic that created them lingered, visible in every gap in the archive, every carefully edited anecdote, every official statement that circled delicately around the years when the wing was most heavily used. And somewhere in an institutional collection today, folded between more mundane estate papers, there lies a single item that seems to have slipped through the pattern of control, a press clipping draft, never printed, in which an early 20th century journalist sketched the outline of a story tying a Fifth Avenue mansion to a labor disaster on the other side of the city. The article breaks off mid-column, its last handwritten note reading, "Sources indicate private meetings held in North Rooms, names to confirm." Across that line, in a different ink, someone has drawn one decisive stroke, striking through both the clue and the question in a single motion. A small, brutal mark that still sits there, a quiet diagonal shadow cutting across the page like a final wordless warning to leave the story and the wing officially untold. Time, in cities like New York, rarely preserves power in its original form. It grinds it down, repackages it, and sells it back as nostalgia. By the early decades of the 20th century, the Fifth Avenue that had once been dominated by vast stone mansions was already beginning to shift. Shops encroached, hotels rose. Apartment buildings promised a new kind of luxury that no longer required an army of servants. One by one, the great houses of the Gilded Age were sold, subdivided, or simply leveled, their marble staircases and carved doorways reduced to dust and salvage. In that slow erasure, the Astor Mansion joined a broader pattern. What had once been a stage for live power turned into a half-remembered backdrop, then into a story. With demolition and remodeling came a convenient amnesia. When walls fell, whatever they had once concealed fell with them. The sealed wing, once a tightly controlled risk, became a former risk. A problem solved not through accountability, but through disappearance. As ownership changed, descriptive language softened. Real estate brochures spoke of a distinguished residence formerly occupying this site, not of the forbidden rooms and sealed corridors that had once housed volatile decisions. Newspaper columns reminisced about the days when the Astors set the tone for society, carefully choosing anecdotes about glittering balls instead of the private negotiations that had shaken behind closed doors in the North Wing. By the time Hollywood's golden age began mining the recent past for inspiration, the concrete scandal potential of such spaces had already been dulled into something safer. Film sets borrowed the aesthetic, sweeping staircases, heavy drapes, chandeliers throwing fractured light across parquet floors, but stripped away the real stakes. On screen, a locked door in a mansion signaled romance, a family curse, or at worst, a tasteful murder mystery. The true dynamics of hidden heirs, backroom campaign deals, or brutal labor understandings seldom made the script. The discomfort of the actual history was trimmed down into consumable elegance. The house, and others like it, entered popular memory not as engines of inequality, but as scenery. Descendants and chroniclers of the great families often aided this transformation. When interviewed, they chose stories that fit the new narrative. Eccentric relatives, amusing superstitions, a grandmother who refused to enter a certain hallway after dark, for reasons left playfully unexplained. The sealed wing, if mentioned at all, became part of the charm. Oh, there was a silly bricked-up section father joked about, spoken with a dismissive wave. In memoirs, oddities that had once concealed a dark legacy were recast as quaint flourishes, the structural equivalent of a family story about a lost heirloom. Without the original documents, the letters, the receipts, the legal drafts, the past could be curated into something that no longer threatened the living. What remained for historians were fragments, floor plans that did not match, correspondence with pages missing, anecdotes that contradicted one another depending on who was telling them. One heir remembered the northern rooms as unused storage, another as where the old offices must have been. A third insisted, confidently, that the house had no such wing at all, even as a faded blueprint in an archive drawer traced its outline in clear ink. These silent witnesses, paper, brick, photographs, could no longer be cross-examined like living people. Their testimony existed only in juxtaposition, a mark here, an erasure there, a door that appeared in one drawing and vanished from the next. As the decades stretched, the story simplified. Popular histories of New York's Gilded Age made passing mention of peculiar habits among the elite. Certain families rumored to keep entire floors closed off, servants forbidden from speaking of what they saw, whispers of rooms no one entered. But these details were often presented with a wink as atmospheric flair. When the sealed Astor wing appeared in such retellings, It did so as a ghost story, not as a clinical risk assessment undertaken by a dynasty guarding its investments. And its name. The heavy calculations about scandal, taxation, and political vulnerability faded into the background, replaced by an almost cozy fascination with Golden Age secrets. This process, turning raw, dangerous history into something ornamental, served the same interests that had once ordered documents burned and walls rebuilt. A legend about a locked wing with a tragic love story attached to it is harmless. It does not invite subpoenas, policy debates, or reparations. It can be repeated on guided tours, dramatized in mini-series, or used as a thematic backdrop for costly themed galas. The aesthetic of secrecy remains, but its bite is gone. The discomfort is made consumable, folded into a narrative that flatters both the living and the dead. The forbidden rooms become, at worst, a symbol of emotional repression, not a holding cell for choices that shaped laws, markets, and lives beyond the property line. And as the story softens, the responsibility diffuses. Without the original letters linking campaign money to specific votes, without the signed agreements consigning certain heirs to obscurity, without the memoranda acknowledging knowledge of unsafe conditions or illegal tactics, what is left can always be dismissed as speculation. "We may never know," becomes the closing line of many accounts, said with a tone halfway between regret and relief. The house slips from being a suspect to being a curiosity. The sealed wing, once a focal point of deliberate erased records, becomes just one more piece of a sepia-toned collage titled Old New York. Yet the physical and archival residue resists total domestication. A researcher comparing building records notices that an insurance map indicates interior divisions that do not correspond to any published photograph of the mansion. A faint note in a studio production file for a period film mentions the set designer visiting an older relative's recollections of the Astor house, including the bricked corridor, a phrase later crossed out and replaced with family hallway. In oral histories, pauses grow longer when certain years are discussed. Laughter appears where an answer should be. The myth protects, but it does not fully erase the outline of what it was built to cover. The result is a double image. On one side, there is the popular vision. Glittering rooms, elegant silhouettes moving through candlelit halls, distant music, the romance of a lost world. On the other, if you look carefully, there is something else. Little discontinuities that never quite resolve. A family story that trails off mid-sentence. A photograph of a facade where the window count doesn't match the final plan. A modern coffee table book that proudly reproduces a complete floor diagram, except for a small, unlabeled void on the upper floors that is simply shaded in, as if to say, this area, whatever it once was, no longer needs a name. And somewhere, tucked between glossy pages and curated captions, you might notice it, a reproduced portrait of the mansion's most famous patriarch, surrounded by family in their finest dress. The image is crisp, the details painstakingly restored. The sheen on the silk, the gleam of jewelry, the carved edge of a chair. At first glance, it serves its purpose perfectly, reinforcing the myth of order and continuity. But near the edge of the frame, half hidden by a column, there hangs a small framed photograph on the wall behind them. Its surface is blurred, the figure within indistinct, as though deliberately left out of focus when everything else was sharpened. No caption mentions it, no index lists its subject. It sits there, an object inside an image, quietly contradicting the polished story on the page, like a forgotten witness still lingering in the corner, refusing to disappear completely. If we take everything that survives, the blueprints that don't quite match, the misfiled letters, the payroll anomalies, the insurance, vagueness, and lay it all out on a long table, the temptation is to sketch a romantic story, a hidden love affair, a tragic death, a ghost. But the evidence we have points to something more sober, and in its own way, far more unsettling. The sealed northern wing of the Astor Mansion most likely did not house a single melodramatic secret, but a configuration of spaces designed to manage the dangerous intersection of money, law, and reputation. In other words, a place built not for sentiment, but for control. Reconstructing that lost interior means working backward from the patterns we know. The proximity of those north side guest rooms, used less for hospitality and more for delicate understandings, strongly suggests that part of the wing functioned as a suite of private offices. Not the grand library where visitors might be entertained, but smaller rooms, paneled in darker wood, with desks turned away from the windows and filing cabinets placed along interior walls. This was where correspondence tied to specific dates, specific votes, specific accidents would have been read and discussed. A clerk might arrive through a quieter entrance, hat in hand, carrying a leather folio whose contents never appeared in the family's official archive. The door would close with a soft click, muffling the city outside, and the conversation inside would proceed with the kind of careful phrasing that leaves just enough unsaid to survive discovery. Alongside these offices, the logic of the era argues for a dedicated archive of financial and legal correspondence. Other dynasties kept similar rooms, long, narrow spaces lined with shelves, steel boxes, and fireproof cabinets, all keyed to a system that only a handful of people understood. Deeds, trust agreements, side letters to contracts, drafts of wills with alternative bequests, paper that could not simply be left in a general safe or sent to a law firm where future partners might stumble upon it. In the Astor case, that archive would explain why insurance notes vaguely referenced private records, client elects not to specify, and why certain valuations in the inventories were scratched out instead of itemized. This was not a casual dumping ground. It was an organized vault for material that, if ever released, could trace clear lines from the mansion's polished halls to the harsher realities that funded them. Given the hints about hidden heirs and quietly maintained annuities, it is also plausible that the wing contained a room with a more ambiguous purpose, a discreet bedroom or sitting room suitable for relatives whose presence could not be fully acknowledged elsewhere in the house. There are precedents. Other wealthy families maintained convalescent rooms or private apartments that were never listed in guest registries, reserved instead for a widowed cousin, a child born from an unapproved union, or an aging relation whose habits were considered unsuitable for public view. In the Astor layout, such a room could have connected by a short internal passage to both the offices and the archive, allowing decisions about that person's future and their financial provision to be negotiated without them ever crossing the threshold into the public parts of the mansion. Comparative cases from the same era reinforce this picture. Industrial magnates in other cities are known to have devoted entire floors of their homes to in-house legal counsel, complete with small conference chambers where lawyers and bankers met under strict conditions of confidentiality. Some families built reinforced paper rooms off the back of main libraries, accessible only through disguised doors. Others went so far as to create shadow nurseries or secondary bedrooms where children who complicated clean succession lines could be raised with comfort but without the full acknowledgement that would disrupt public genealogies. Seen through that lens, the Astor North Wing starts to resemble a composite of these functions: part back office, part archive, part human buffer zone. What unites these possibilities is not decor, but purpose. Whether it held desks, cabinets, or a bed, the northern wing appears to have concentrated what the rest of the house could not safely absorb. Here, Golden Age secrets about campaign money, labor settlements, and extra-legal arrangements could be handled without contaminating the grand salons where respectable history was performed. Here, forbidden rooms did not exist to thrill visitors, but to ensure they never noticed what decisions were made in their shadow. The wing was a membrane between two realities: the public Astor story, polished and linear, and the private one, full of contingencies, negotiations, and compromises. The behavior of the family toward this space supports that reading. While the patriarch lived, access was tightly controlled. A single butler held the key, and no servant not specifically assigned to the area crossed its threshold. After his death, when the risk calculus shifted, the wing was not opened and normalized. It was broken apart, its rooms dismantled, its corridors simplified. That is exactly what you do with a place whose very layout has become incriminating, a place whose existence implies questions about what it once contained. You cannot erase the square footage, property records will remember that, but you can strip the space of distinctiveness and scatter its functions elsewhere, leaving behind only neutral phrases in the inventories and the vaguest of references in insurance files. In this reconstructed view, the north wing becomes less a backdrop for a single dramatic event and more a physical embodiment of an ongoing strategy. It was at once a depot of documents, later burned or selectively destroyed, and a monument to choices that could never be publicly acknowledged. Every closed meeting, every quietly adjusted inheritance, every off-the-record settlement added another layer to its weight. Over time, the house itself began to bend around that weight. Staff patterns shifted, guest circulation rerouted, floor plans redrawn, all to protect a cluster of rooms that no guidebook would mention. The dark legacy of the family did not live only in stories. It lived in hinges, lock plates, and the distances between doors. And yet, even after the wing was physically erased, its outline persists in the contradictions. You can still see it in the way later generations talk about the house, the nervous laughter when the subject of odd corners arises, the insistence that there was nothing interesting up there, from people who never actually walked those corridors. You can see it in archives where one plan shows a sequence of offices and another shows a blank expanse in the same place, as though someone laid tracing paper over a problem and shaded it into oblivion. You can see it in the disproportionate care taken to describe trivial objects in the inventories, while entire categories of correspondence, north, are collapsed into a single ominous word, removed. If we imagine, cautiously, standing inside one of those lost rooms, the scene is not one of Gothic theatrics, but of quiet industry. A desk pushed slightly off-center to catch the best of the afternoon light. Ink stains on blotting paper, layered over years of signatures. A chair left angled toward a door that no longer appears on any official plan. A metal box on a low cabinet, its label long ago peeled away, leaving only a rectangular ghost on the surface. No portraits, no elaborate decoration, just the hum of decisions that affected lives far beyond the window's view. And somewhere, in a climate-controlled repository far from Fifth Avenue, a small item sits among catalogued relics from the estate, a tarnished brass key on a thin chain, tagged by some archivist as unidentified, source Astor household effects. The bow is worn smooth, but along the shaft, under the right angle of light, you can still make out a single stamped character, an almost erased N. There are no surviving locks on any documented door in the house that match its teeth, and no inventory sheet that lists a need for such a key. It should be meaningless, just another artifact stripped of context. Yet, in the long shadow of the sealed wing, it hangs there in the archive drawer like an object out of place, quietly contradicting the official story that nothing of consequence was ever kept or locked in that part of the house at all. If you stand far enough back from the old photographs of Fifth Avenue, the world they capture seems almost perfectly complete. Gas lamps haloed in winter air, carriages drawing up in front of stone facades, light spilling from ballroom windows where orchestras tuned for evenings that would be faithfully recorded in society columns the next morning. The Astor Mansion appears in those images as the embodiment of that Gilded Age promise, symmetrical, commanding, its main entrance flanked by polished stone and carefully managed shadows. In written accounts, the house is described in the same confident detail: the color of the drawing room silk, the height of the ceilings, the glitter of crystal in dining rooms designed to impress foreign guests and local rivals alike. And yet, when you begin to place those descriptions beside the surviving plans, an outline emerges of something that is never described at all, a portion of the house that seems always just out of frame, a sequence of windows that the camera never quite captures, a corridor whose angles are implied but rarely drawn. Over time, that missing section of the mansion has drifted to the edge of the story, like the margin of a page that no one expects the reader to examine closely. The official histories speak of philanthropy, marriages, and architectural taste. They rarely dwell on the sealed northern wing, the forbidden rooms that staff avoided, or the butler whose key opened doors no guest ever saw. In archives, lists of artworks, silver, and furniture are preserved with reverence, while entire categories of correspondence, North Archive, vanish into the convenient shorthand of destroyed as unnecessary. What remains is not a full picture, but a negative space, a pattern of erased records and altered layouts that, taken together, tell us that something significant once lived there, even if its exact shape has been carefully shaved away. This is one of the quiet truths of elite American history. What is missing from the record is often more revealing than what was lovingly kept. Families like the Astors were meticulous curators of their own memory. They preserved invitations to important balls, commissioned portraits, bound diaries, and even stored newspaper clippings that flattered their role in public life. That the sealed wing left so little behind is not an accident of time. It is the result of deliberate choices about which parts of their influence could be allowed to survive the transition from private act to historical fact. In that sense, the North Wing becomes less a physical absence and more a kind of architectural footnote, a reminder that between the grand narratives of wealth and respectability lay entire rooms where the real work of protecting that image took place. By the time the mansion itself disappeared, sold, altered, eventually reduced to a memory that could be sold as atmosphere, most of the people who had moved through those restricted corridors were gone. The lawyers who advised on risky settlements, the clerks who delivered unlabeled envelopes, the butler who paused at the threshold of the sealed doors and listened for any sound on the other side. All of them joined the category of silent witnesses whose testimony can no longer be summoned. What they left instead are traces. A payroll line that makes no sense unless there was a wing to guard. A building inspection that mentions a door where later plans insist there is only wall. A family anecdote that laughs away an entire section of the house as nothing important, even as the tone tightens for a half-second too long. As the decades passed, the story of that sealed section softened into myth, then into decor. The dangerous potential of whatever it had once held, letters tying campaign money to policy, agreements about hidden heirs, drafts of trusts that nearly reshaped the family tree, was drained away and replaced with anecdotes that could be dropped at dinner. You know, there used to be a locked wing no one entered, said with the same cadence as a ghost story. The discomfort of that dark legacy was repackaged into something almost charming, folded into the wider trend of treating the Gilded Age as a glittering costume drama, rather than a period of ferocious power management. In coffee table books and period dramas, the sealed wing becomes a mood, not a mechanism. Yet the gaps have not entirely lost their edge. For anyone willing to look closely, the absence of hard evidence does not equal the absence of meaning. The missing papers, the altered plans, the remodeled corridor, the rooms that changed purpose without leaving clear records, these are not neutral erasures. They point toward a sustained effort to keep certain combinations of names, dates, and numbers from ever being seen together. The North Wing, reconstructed through what little remains, appears as a zone where the risks of the era were concentrated, a place where the family confronted the cost of maintaining its position in a world that was beginning to question how such positions were built. Today, the mansion lives on mostly in photographs, stylized drawings, and the language of nostalgia. Its image floats through documentaries, novels, and films as shorthand for a world of old money security. But if you pause on those images, on the facades, the ballroom shots, the carefully composed family portraits, you begin to notice that something is always cropped away. A corner of the house that never quite fits the camera frame, a line of windows dimmer than the rest, a portion of the upper floors repeatedly obscured by trees, awnings, or the edge of the plate. The sealed wing survives precisely in what is not shown, in the angles that refuse to resolve into clarity. In that sense, the silence around it outlived the walls themselves. The bricks and beams of the north wing may be gone, its rooms dispersed into other structures or lost to demolition, but the logic that created them is still with us. It lingers in how estates are summarized, how archives are weeded, how uncomfortable questions about inherited power are redirected toward safer topics. Every time a ledger compresses a category of sensitive material into a single shrug of a phrase, various papers removed, it repeats in miniature the same gesture that once locked those doors on the upper floors of the Astor House. And so, when we speak of Fifth Avenue and myth, we are really looking at the tension between what the historical record is willing to say and what its silences still imply. The sealed wing of the Astor Mansion is gone, but its outline remains in the archival void it left behind, an empty shape tracing the border between what the era allowed itself to remember and what it quietly agreed must never be fully acknowledged. Somewhere, in a folder labeled with an innocuous call number, a researcher can still open a brittle page and find a neatly typed line describing the house in its final assessment. Rooms counted, floors listed, values assigned. And there, in the middle of that measured certainty, a single entry has been struck through so firmly that the original words cannot be recovered, leaving only a rough scar of ink where a designation once stood, like the last, stubborn shadow of a door the record insists was never there. In the end, all that remains on the page is that rough scar of ink where a designation once stood, like the shadow of a door erased from the plan yet still present in the memory of the house. Somewhere behind the polished facades and carefully framed photographs, there were corridors that did not wish to be remembered, files slid back into drawers under low light, and decisions folded away in envelopes that never reached the public archive. The great halls are long gone, but the pattern endures. Bright rooms meticulously documented, and just beside them, a wing consigned to dust, to silence, to absence. Across time, the dust has settled on those missing pages, but the questions have not. These Golden Age secrets, these forbidden rooms, still cast their outline against the record, inviting anyone attentive enough to notice where the light fails to reach. If you wish to keep examining what the elite worked so hard to bury behind polished doors and missing pages, remain with us, beyond the golden halls, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Somewhere, in a ledger, in a photograph, in a plan redrawn too neatly, another erased threshold is still waiting to be noticed. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.